I have fully beaten Starfield's Shattered Space expansion, completed the main story, found some companions, tried out some new weapons, and even adventured around doing some of the side content. So here, I'm going to give you my review after completing about 100% of this DLC, and one of the first things you'll notice is I'm able to post this review just a few days after release because, yeah, while I do have a ton of positives to say about Shattered Space, right off the bat we do need to establish that this is a relatively small expansion, and I think for many of you out there, this probably won't be worth that $30 price tag. But that's not to say this is all bad. In concept, Shattered Space is a simple savior story. A failed experiment led to a catastrophe on the mysterious homeworld of House Faroon, and through some unusual circumstances, we are dispatched to help the people living here. Unlike the rest of Starfield, this does not take place all across the galaxy, and in reality, you could play basically all of Shattered Space without fast traveling. You will just be required to explore this immediate area around the newly added Dazra city, which right at the bat is probably the coolest city added in Starfield so far. This place looks and feels amazing. And as you probably have seen, the world space here is definitely a highlight. I honestly don't think I've seen anyone not love this place. Dazra City itself is entirely handcrafted, and even scattered around, you'll find secondary locations that are manually made there by Bethesda. Those randomly generated points of interest are going to be few and far between with your experience here. As you walk around the city, it truly feels like a foreign place. The weathers here are striking and completely unique compared to the rest of the settled systems, and even the architecture is quite distinct. You don't just find one temple, but several holy shrines with very distinct designs that were consistently epic. Bethesda used different building kits for these locations, so even minor things like walls, floors, and stairs will all feel completely foreign. And compared to the rest of the settled systems, the people here will have these odd accents as well as an abundance of face tattoos, which really just adds to the immersion of this being a strange and new place. Exploration during Shattered Space will be completely different compared to the rest of Starfield. There are roads connecting all of the major locations, and using the recently added Rev 8 buggy, you can drive around, and this makes exploration a lot more enjoyable. I wouldn't say exploration is perfect, I still definitely prefer Fallout 4 or Skyrim, but compared to just jetpacking around or fast traveling, this is a massive upgrade. Although the lack of a call vehicle button as you're out and on the go is definitely felt while playing this DLC. And it's via some of this exploration that you can uncover full-fledged side quests. This was somewhat a return to form to that Bethesda exploration magic, breaking into a tomb to find an injured NPC that leads you on to an entire journey, and hey, you just drove here. But the exploration is definitely not a full-on return to form. As to me, it really felt like Shattered Space was missing some of the hidden things. A lot of times exploring just didn't yield all that much. While you will find some interesting side quests and other interactions, but some of the cool stuff and things was definitely missing in Dazra. There really isn't much out there, and several of the locations that you do discover will be pretty locked down until you return later on during the appropriate questline. So yes, the exploration got a clear upgrade, but not to the point of being as good as past Bethesda games. But one thing Bethesda did do incredibly well with Shattered Space is making you feel transported. In a game where you're constantly flying around to different locations and experiencing different cultures, they still managed to make Dazra City and the House Faroon people feel completely foreign, and that makes the first few hours of this DLC very exciting. It all feels new and unique, which sucks you in quite a bit. The main story here is fine. It's a solid 5 to 6 hours of basically solving these people's problems as well as political disputes. This failed experiment led to wide-scale destruction, so parts of the city are just missing, enemies are wreaking havoc on these people, new threats are popping out on the outskirts where people used to live, and even the leader of House Faroon is missing. So in typical Bethesda fashion, we more or less have to solve all of these problems for them. Early on, I was super into the main story. It follows that chosen one path where, for certain reasons, this highly religious group of people believe that we are sent from their god to save them, and one of the first things you need to do is properly join the House Faroon religion. From a narrative perspective, this has been getting a lot of criticism, and I understand why. There really isn't a route forward other than to join this religion. One of the first quests will force you to do so. That happening in a game where you can literally take traits to subscribe to other religions as you're making your character. Being forced into this one definitely hampers roleplay, at least somewhat. What I found in actual gameplay is there actually is a nice mix of responses. I personally opted to basically roleplay as a devout religious figure. But if you're not super religious and just want to act like you're going along with all of this for the money, you can pretty consistently do that and say that throughout this main story, which is pretty nice. Overall, the roleplayability of Shattered Space felt a bit better than the base game of Starfield. You even have quite a few skill checks and even trait checks all throughout. So while I have seen many people frustrated with the forced religious activity, for me at least it didn't actually affect the experience all that much. And I found the religious aspects of this to be pretty cool. You'd meet a range of people who either fully believed in the Great Serpent to some others who had clear doubts, and then even other NPCs who were complete outsiders all new to this. And this will extend to your own feelings as well. One of the things I think they nailed is, while I was playing this main story, I genuinely started to ask myself if the Great Serpent was real or not. Are these happy coincidences or divine intervention? The DLC overall does a good job at not forcing you into an answer one way or the other, and instead allows you to believe what you want. And overall, this is a society that's motivated by religion, and where religion plays a major role in their decision making, which did make for a compelling backdrop as you progress through some of these main story quests. But as I got a bit deeper, the main story does start to get a bit formulaic. The crux of this will be that you need to help the various houses of the Va'ruun Council and get them all to agree to do something. Each house holds a piece of this puzzle, and you need all of the puzzle pieces to solve this larger problem. So early on, the quest will basically just open up, giving you options to help each of these various houses, but you can kind of go at your own pace solving this. As you could probably imagine, as you go to each house leader for that puzzle piece, you'll have some kind of quest where you could basically go and fetch it for them. These quests will largely boil down to clearing out a dungeon to get something at the end of the dungeon, although the formula did go a step further than that. Each of the major houses had a secondary optional objective. Typically, this was given by some lackey, but basically the house leader wants you to go and do something, and the secondary character wants you to actually change up the plan slightly. So the house leader might be like, please save these hostages, but then the second character will come up and ask you to kill the hostages. So there was a bit of extra flavor on each of the major quests, but after seeing the second quest do this, I kind of felt the formula in action, and that definitely took me out of things a bit. I think even for many of you, now that I've laid this all out, as you play through Shattered Space, you'll start to see, oh yeah, they're kind of doing the same thing with each of these major quests. Although, in fairness to Bethesda, while it did start to feel fairly formulaic, they did add in some nice modifiers to increase the intrigue on each of these major quests. During one, you're searching for this guy's kid, but you have this total outsider with you that didn't grow up in Va'ruun, so they provide a unique perspective on everything the whole time. He's later available as a crew member / companion. Another quest involves backstabbing and has an entire secret subplot, and with what was my favorite out of these core story quests, diving more into what the experiment that failed actually was and what ended up going wrong. And one of the things that did really elevate this further are some of the settings. Some of the moments during the main story can just be described as epic, true trailer shots that you actually get to live out in real time. This happens periodically throughout the story, but particularly towards the end, you get some really awesome moments. And part of this is just the visuals, fighting in caves with raw energy coming from all over, finally getting to see this giant laser blast the Citadel. While playing through Shattered Space, it definitely feels like Bethesda was taking advantage of their upgraded engine at points. Because even beyond that, a bunch more happened. I don't want to spoil all of it, but quite a few times during Shattered Space, you'll just want to stop and take in everything that's happening around you because, yeah, it's freaking cool. As well as this DLC does feature a ton of choice. Several quests, both main and side, have wildly different outcomes depending on what you do. There'll be numerous points where you'll want to save and play out the other path just to see what happens. So unfortunately, your choices don't necessarily always have the biggest consequences, but I think there is something to be said about the illusion of consequence from your choice. The choices definitely make you feel empowered during these quest lines, and I think that is pretty effective. But you still don't really get major items as quest rewards, which at least for me did kind of take away from it somewhat. Perhaps it sounds silly, but just getting credits over and over felt a bit disappointing. Although overall, at the very least, it did feel like you had a lot of options on how to direct things, and that is a nice feeling as you're questing. Doing the story with Andrea is definitely an upgrade. This is the companion with House Va'ruun ties from the base game, and she had a fair amount to weigh in on and say, even having a more extended conversation after the DLC ends about her thoughts on what happened. But it still feels like she was massively underutilized. Walking into this foreign culture with somebody who already understands it, I was hoping for guidance, and numerous times I had a tough choice in front of me that was going to heavily impact the House Va'ruun people, and Andrea had nothing to say. I was begging for more input to the point where I literally went up to her trying to get more dialogue, but oftentimes it wasn't there. Most of Andrea's contribution would be one-liners around some of the events events during Shattered Space, as opposed to full-on conversations about what is going on. Although thankfully, in some of the side quests, she can actually speak for you, and I thought that was a nice touch. But overall, I just wish there was more from this character. The DLC is definitely better with Andrea with you than not, but it feels like there's a whole nother level they could have gone to that they didn't. But at this point, you might be sitting here thinking, okay, this all sounds pretty good. Why wouldn't I recommend this DLC to at least some people? Well, Shattered Space really has two major problems that degrade it for me. It's expensive and small, and the writing overall is just not all that interesting. A good amount of the story felt kind of tropey. The quest setups and really the environments can be super interesting, but as you get into the questing itself, some things start to feel predictable, or like you've done a quest with this exact concept before, and you probably have. Like, to be clear here, there's nothing about Shattered Space's main story that stood out to me as being particularly bad or poorly done, but outside of some epic visuals during certain moments, there was also nothing about this story that was particularly revolutionary. It didn't have particularly low lows, but it also didn't have high highs. From the earlier moments, the religion aspect did draw me in, as it was so foreign, and I'm going through this whole Dune lover phase in real life right now. There are quite a few similarities between Shattered Space and Dune, but then, as you progress and peel back some layers, you start to realize that a lot of House Faroon culture only gets as deep as the Great Serpent, and you just kind of hear about that over and over and over again. They don't really dive too deeply into the religion during some of the main quests, and to me, this felt like a missed opportunity. I was kind of hoping for some truly trippy and otherworldly content here, but that just never comes. It's all fairly tame stuff, and the same is true for the political intrigue. It's more just doing quests for people that happen to hold political roles, as opposed to any real political actions yourself outside of some ending decisions. Although one thing that does stand out here is during Shattered Space's main quest, there are some genuinely tough choices. Like, you will sit back and have to ponder for a bit, which was nice to have. It was really during these moments that I wish Andrea played a larger role and was able to weigh in herself. I think that would have truly elevated the experience. But I also would have loved to learn more about each of these respective houses and their cultures. Each house that you deal with has a certain role and job in Dazra. I think extra quests fleshing out these aspects would have gone a long way. But at least for me, as I was doing the main story, everything kind of just blended together. You do start to recognize their distinct ideals, but I didn't care all that much about these specific characters. And part of that is you don't really spend that much time with any individual character. It'd really just be a few interactions during their quest, and then you move on to the next group. And I am recognizing here I'm having trouble putting into words what I didn't like. It's almost hard to describe. It just, at least for me, the writing wasn't that compelling here. I ended up caring more about the idea of House Faroon and what it seemed like their culture was, while the actual characters were largely forgettable and nothing really stood out in a big way. Mysteries weren't really all that mysterious. You'll probably figure most of them out on your own. You'd have characters offer side objectives, but then if I don't follow their path, I could just never talk about that again. I was hoping for more of an outcome and more interactions around some of these choices and alternative pathways. And for some, I realized that they did have a bit of a more interesting backstory, but you couldn't necessarily talk about that. It wasn't like there was dialogue options around it that you could bring up. And just overall, the DLC is pretty short. I was going fairly slow at parts and really trying to get immersed in this world, but I still beat the main story in 6 hours. On a second playthrough, I think you get that a lot closer to 4 hours. And like for me personally, I don't really care how long it is or isn't as long as it's a compelling story, but Shattered Space felt small. Once you get to the grand finale, you kind of think to yourself, that's it? I thought there would be more to do and more exploration of House Faroon. Thankfully, some of the side content is quite a bit more enjoyable, at least in my opinion. There's a healthy number of side quests, and many of these also do have very differing outcomes depending on what decisions you make. The side quests will dive deeper into the story of the peoples of House Faroon. You'll deal with robbed crypts, a dispute between two brothers, someone stealing some groats, and even getting closer to the Great Serpent and his true ideals. At points, the story did get a little woe is me. There's some random encounters around Dazra that show you the plight of the citizens, but after 10 hours of, oh my god, I'm so sorry all of this happened to you, it did start to get a little old. Even by the end, it doesn't really feel like many of their problems are solved in any way, but at least for me, I found the side questing to be a bit better than the main story for Shattered Space, although it's not like it was dramatically better, just a couple of extra points. And what I did really like was how these side quests gave you a deeper understanding and appreciation of the culture here. And I particularly like how Bethesda didn't just tell you about the culture in a note or on a terminal or something. Instead, most of the time, you would actually see family interacting with each other, whether it was drama or quite literally a duel to the death, and it was through these interactions that you could see how the culture was such a motivation and had such an impact on the decision making, on the way of thinking of these people. They're making choices that kind of felt odd or strange to you, and you start to realize, oh, it's because they were raised in a different way, and I thought that was a really cool insight. It was a cool thing to experience as you play more and more of this DLC. And if anything, I wish we got much more of that overall. I still don't really feel like I have a super great understanding of the House Varun people. It definitely feels like there are many more stories that can be told here, and hopefully modders do bring that. And at least for me, there was no side quest that completely blew me away. The duel is cool, and I think a lot of people will prefer that one. It'll be one of their favorite quests from the DLC. I spent some time going through each of the individual outcomes that you could get from this quest, but it was still just pretty good. Nothing in Shattered Space really blew me away like some quests in Phantom Liberty or even Fallout 76's main story did. And yes, I recognize both of those are bizarre comparisons, but when it does come to my overall review of the DLC and the question of, should you buy this? Should you return to Starfield to play this? I do have quite a few more issues with Shattered Space overall. The content itself is pretty enjoyable. I had fun throughout my time with Shattered Space, but I could not shake this feeling that it just felt small. There are 2 new weapons as well as new grenades included with this one. The weapons are cool, you'll find them and most likely immediately want to start using them, but it felt like there should be more, and even more specifically, it felt like there should be more custom weapons as quest rewards as you play. This is a deadly warrior culture at points, but I can't even get a cool new sword. You can find a unique set of armor during one of the quests, and you do get an apartment after finishing the main story, but otherwise, most of the rewards are just going to be credits here. The new enemies are okay. I wouldn't say this is a positive or negative on the DLC, at least for me. I particularly like these new redeemed enemies, but the enemies do start to feel kind of samey because you just fight the same people over and over again. You have zealots that teleport, and then melee creatures or melee enemies. The actual combat flow itself is very similar to the base game. Even though some enemies would teleport around, they would just kind of be like they're flanking you when you shoot them from afar anyway. Bethesda talked about some more aggressive combat AI and even larger horror elements from this DLC. And while yeah, I get what they were going for with that, in actual gameplay terms, it wasn't all that different compared to the base game. And at least in my opinion, Shattered Space is definitely not a horror DLC. There are 2 new companions, but these are more crew members. You'll meet both of these during the main quest, and as long as you keep them alive during their respective quests, you can later recruit them, but they are fairly basic. Questing around, they don't have much to say beyond combat encounters or the occasional observation, and they don't have their own quest lines. So I pretty quickly just switched back to using Andrea because it felt like these companions had far less commentary on what was going on compared to the main Starfield companions. And outside of some very cool looking new armors that you'll see pop up in this world, that's pretty much everything included with this DLC. There's nothing I explicitly disliked about Shattered Space, except I think it's overpriced, and it feels like instead of Bethesda going above and beyond, they just did what they needed to get this DLC out there and having enough content for players. And that is one of the big negatives. Shattered Space just felt small, particularly when you compare it to something like Far Harbor, or even more timely, the recently released for the same exact purchase price, Phantom Liberty. For $30, Phantom Liberty just has far more content, where Shattered Space feels like it should have been a $20 or maybe even a $15 DLC. I already know there's going to be pushback in the comments about me making some of these comparisons, but just to be clear, this isn't me comparing spec sheets of how many weapons were in Far Harbor and Phantom Liberty versus Shattered Space, or how many quests did each of them have. I don't really care about all of that. It was just while playing Shattered Space, it felt like there should be more. There's some DLCs that would feel perfectly fine with the amount of content that Shattered Space got, but when it comes to this particular experience, being a full year after release, and even more importantly, taking you to this completely new and foreign world, yeah, it just felt like there should have been more new stuff. I found myself consistently searching for and being disappointed by the lack of new and interesting items, and even by the lack of quests. I wish there were more quests fleshing out these peoples. I think it would have done a lot for the DLC overall, and I think the game will see major player drop-offs as a result of this one. Once you finish this DLC, which could just take a few days, and you don't even have to spend that much time during each of those games playing, play just for 2 to 4 hours per night, and after a couple of nights, you will have a significant portion of this DLC complete. And I think once you're done with this, there's not a ton of reasons to stick around. It's impossible to ignore the broader Starfield situation as we enter into Shattered Space. It felt like to me that if Bethesda had a big DLC that really knocked it out of the park, it could have turned things around for Starfield, convince a lot of players who were unhappy with the base game that, yeah, this is a good reason to come back, and Starfield isn't as bad as you thought. But Shattered Space doesn't really feel like that, and it doesn't even feel like they were really going for that with this one. The content itself is pretty good, but this is definitely not Bethesda at their best, and it's definitely one of their smaller DLCs overall. I think if you enjoyed Starfield enough and already own the DLC, like if you bought it or if you bought the premium edition, yeah, you should play this one. It's solid content that most of you are going to have fun with, but it really is a story-focused experience that you'll likely finish in a week or so. And conversely, if you don't own Starfield or don't already own this DLC, $30 is a steep price for the amount of content you're getting here. I would honestly just wait for a sale down the road unless you're a particularly big fan of Starfield already. Overall, those are my thoughts on Shattered Space, and I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments down below. What did you think about this DLC, particularly from those of you who have actually played it, not the swarm of people that are just going to click on this video to immediately comment Starfield bad, because yeah, you clicked on the Starfield video, dude. With that said, get subscribed if you're interested in more Bethesda content, but for me, I think this DLC was kind of a test of should I go back to making a ton of Starfield videos, and I don't think I will be. I'll likely have a few more coming out in the wake of the DLC's release. I'd like to cover some of the mods, as well as some of the other features of the DLC, but after that, probably back to Fallout, Cyberpunk, and maybe even Baldur's Gate 3. As always, again, I thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, but with that, I hope to see you all next time. Later.